Remarks of the President at the 47th Annual Meeting of the Florida State Chamber of Commerce from the Fort Hesterly Armory in Tampa, Florida, November 18th, 1963.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Chairman, your distinguished governor, Senator Smathers, Congressman Sam Gibbons, Danny Purcell, Claude Pepper, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here at this distinguished gathering. I came at the suggestion of the senior senator of Florida, Senator Smathers, who represents this state with distinction and also is, of course, the majority whip in the Senate and therefore speaks for the United States. So I'm glad to come here as the son of two citizens of Florida, my mother and father, come here with your governor, who has helped make the decisions which I think will make progress in Florida possible not only now but in the future. And I'm glad particularly to be here with this group who played such a leading role, Tom Fleming and others, in securing the passage of the bonds which will make it possible for Florida to have the kind of educational system which is necessary for leadership in this state and country. I said before, and in the presence once of the governor, that I felt that the extraordinary progress which California had made in many technical and engineering fields was due to the emphasis which that state had put on higher education. And I think the effort which this state is making to make your schools and colleges and universities as good as they possibly can be, to make it possible for you to take care of the twice as many boys and girls who will be trying to get into our colleges in 1970 as were in 1960. Because this group, which ordinarily might not be regarded as free spenders, supported this great state effort, I want to commend you. A little more than 1 year ago, when our bill to grant a tax credit for business investment was before the Congress, Secretary of the Treasury Dillon was on a plane to this state, and he found himself talking to one of the leading Florida businessmen about the investment tax credit. He spent some time, he later told me, explaining how the bill would help this man's corporate outlook and income, and the businessman was most impressed. And finally, as the plane landed at Miami, he turned to Secretary Dillon and said, "I'm very grateful to you for explaining the bill. Now tell me just once more, why is it I'm against it?" That story is unfortunately not an exaggeration. Many businessmen who are prospering as never before during this administration are convinced, nevertheless, that we must be anti-business. With the new figures on corporate profits after taxes having reached an all-time high, running some 43% higher than they were just 3 years ago, they still suspect us of being opposed to private profit. With the most stable price level of any comparable economic recovery in our history, the most stable price level of any comparable economic recovery in our history, they still fear that we're promoting inflation. We have liberalized depreciation guidelines to grant more individual flexibility, reduced our farm surpluses, reduced transportation taxes, established a private corporation to manage our satellite communication system, increased the role of American business in the development of less developed countries, and proposed to the Congress a sharp reduction in corporate as well as personal income taxes and a major deregulation of transportation. And yet many businessmen are convinced that a Democratic administration is out to soak the rich, increase controls for the sake of controls, and extend at all costs the scope of the federal bureaucracy. The hard facts contradict these doubts. This administration is interested in the healthy expansion of our economy. We are interested in the steady progress of our society. And it is in this kind of program, in my opinion, in which American business has the largest stake. Why is it that profits are at an all-time high in the nation today? It is because the nation as a whole is prospering. It is because our gross national product is rising from $500 billion to $600 billion, a record rise of $100 billion in 3 years, 36 months. It is because industrial production in the last 3 years has increased 22% and personal income by 15%. It is because, as the Wall Street Journal pointed out last week, the United States now leads most of Western Europe in the rate of business expansion. For the first time in many years, in the last 18 months, our growth rate exceeds that of France or Germany. It is because as Fortune magazine recently pointed out, corporate profits in America are now rising much faster than corporate profits overseas. It is because these profits have not been eaten up by an inflationary spiral. And finally, it is because we have reversed the dismal trend towards even more frequent recessions, which are the greatest enemy of profit. By next April, with the indispensable help of the pending tax cut bill, the United States will be sailing with the winds of the longest and strongest peacetime economic expansion in our nation's entire history. I do not say that all this is due to the administration alone, but neither is it all accidental. The fiscal and monetary policies which we have followed are the key element in whether the economy moves towards a path of expansion or restriction. In the last 3 years, American business and industry have directly benefited from a host of our legislative and administrative actions, which increase corporate cash flow, increase markets at home and abroad, increase consumer purchasing power, and increase plant modernization and productivity. And still other steps have been taken to curb the wage price spiral. The first 6 months of 1963, there were less time lost in strikes than any time since the Second World War. To hold down the cost of credit and to bring more harmony into industrial relations. I do not say that these actions were taken for the benefit of business alone. They were taken to benefit the country. Some of them were labeled pro-business. Some of them were labeled anti-business. Some of them were labeled both by opposing groups. But that kind of label is meaningless. This administration is pro the public interest. Nor do I say that all of these policies could please all American businessmen all of the time. So long as the interests and views of businessmen frequently clash with each other, no president could possibly please them all. Most businessmen, though perhaps not most business spokesmen, are associated with small business. They ask the government for assistance to protect them against monopoly, to assure them of reasonable credit, to enable them to participate in defense contracts. And both large and small business work with the various arms of the administration every day on trade, transportation, procurement, balance of payments, and international business affairs. They do not show the hostility which is so often described, or find that our policies and personnel are so incompatible with their own. Businessmen are welcome at the White House, and I welcome the chance to address business meetings such as this. Not because I expect that it will necessarily affect the results of the elections, But I do think it can affect what this country does and how it moves ahead, and whether we're going to be able to find jobs for all the people that need them, and whether we're going to build the kind of a country in which all of us can take pride and credit. And that's the kind of cooperative effort which I invite from businessmen and from other interested citizens. If we can keep open the channels of communication, this country can make progress ahead. To further that understanding, I would like to answer 4 questions that I'm most frequently asked by businessmen, or written about, or written to. The first and most frequently asked question is the federal government growing so large that our private economy is endangered? My answer to that is no. The federal government has been growing for 175 years. Our population has grown even faster. Our territory and economy have grown and become more closely linked. The size of our business, labor, farm, and other establishments and organizations have grown. Above all, our responsibilities around the world have grown, and our stake in world peace has grown immeasurably. Life itself is more complex, and the American people in the 20th century have come to expect more from governmental action. But there has been no sudden spurt in the growth of government under this administration. Leaving national security outlays aside, federal civilian expenditures today, when measured as they should be measured in a growing economy, as a percentage of our national output, are no higher than they were at the end of the Second World War. A mere 5% of our gross national product is not a threat to our economy. The real growth, and this will not come as a surprise to your governor, the real growth in government has been at the state and local level. Between 1948 and 1962, while federal civilian expenditures were rising by 65%, state spending on the average across this country rose by 227%, from less than $10 billion in 48 to over $30 billion in 1962. Florida's state expenditures in that same period rose by 270%, or more than 4 times as fast percentage-wise as the federal budget. Georgia by 331%, Ohio by 300%, Kentucky by 431%. The federal government has no desire to expand the size and scope of its activities merely for the sake of expansion. Many tasks would never have been taken on by the Congress had they been able to be fulfilled at the state and local level. And this administration has made efforts to transfer to private ownership many of the financial assets held by the government, to substitute private for public credit, to reduce farm surpluses, to dispose of excess commodities, and to make our transportation system less restrictive. This is a far cry, I believe, from a government too big for the economy. And secondly, I'm asked, are not continuing deficits and the mounting national debt certain to drive us into bankruptcy? And my answer to that is no. Once again, we must look at these facts in perspective. From 1948 to 1962, the total federal debt increased less than 20%. We had the Korean War, all our obligations abroad, a tremendously growing country, tremendously growing population. The federal debt grew by less than 20%, while the average for all the states was 500%. Or taking only the 4 years from 1958 to 1962, the federal debt rose only 8%, while state debt as a whole went up 41%. Obviously, neither the states or the nation are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy as a result of these debts. In 1945, our national debt was 120% of our gross national product. Today, it's 53%. Next year, it'll be 52%. At a time when our debt has gone up by the percentage I described, our gross national product has doubled. And therefore, as this country moves to a $1 trillion economy, which we're moving toward, Quite obviously, as long as we maintain these proportions, the fiscal credit of the United States will still be secure. While the federal net debt was growing less than 20% in these years, total corporate debt, not my debt, your debt, was growing by nearly 200%, and the total indebtedness of private individuals rose by 300%. So who is the most cautious fiscal manager? You gentlemen or us? It is true that the pending tax cut will add to this debt by temporarily reducing federal revenues. But the purpose of the tax cut is not to produce a deficit, but to boost the economy. A full employment economy is the only way to balance the budget. A recession-ridden economy, recessions occurring every 24 or 30 or 32 months, on the other hand, is a guarantee of chronic higher deficits and continually deeper debt. We must remember that in 1958, President Eisenhower sent up a budget to the hip which was in surplus by $500 million. As a result of the deficit of the recession of 1958, that budget ended up that year unbalanced $12.5 billion. The great enemy of the balanced budget is a recession, and it is to prevent a recession and to provide for economic growth and provide for the jobs for the 10 million people who are coming into the labor market in the next 2.5 years that I strongly believe in the tax cut very quickly and not too far away. Third, I'm asked, why can't this administration cut federal expenditures? And my answer is that we have cut. I recommended an additional $620 million of reduction in this year's budget since first submitting it last January. Domestic civilian expenditures, excluding national defense, space, and interest on the debt, domestic civilian expenditures were budgeted below the level of last year, a feat rarely accomplished in the last 15 years. Once 16% larger than state and local expenditures, our federal civilian expenditures are now 43% smaller. What all this suggests is not that the states have been less prudent than we've been, but this country is growing, and the needs are growing. You here in Florida in this chamber know it very well, or you wouldn't have supported a $75 million debt obligation on the people of Florida. You can't tell the children of this state that they can't go to college in 1970 because you didn't take the decisions in 1963. And what we're trying to do in this state is what we're trying to do across the country. What we have to do is be prudent, responsible, selective, make our judgments about what is really necessary and valuable and what can be put aside. That seems to me the essence of responsible management by the national government, by the state government, by the local community, and by a private business. We've reduced the number of federal employees serving every 1,000 people in this country. There are no more people today working for the federal government than there were 10 years ago. Federal employment has not increased in the last 10 years. There are less people working today for the federal government than there were a year ago. But it will go up because this country grows. The question is, in what proportion? But I can assure you that there will be less federal employees serving every 1,000 people next year than there were this year. Secretary McNamara has instituted cost reductions, for example, in the Pentagon, which will save $1 billion a year, and finally save $4 billion a year. We are constantly re-examining these programs to determine what can be done. But many of those who call for larger expenditures are forgetting the growth of our population and the complexities of our problems. And economy advocates from Florida are not opposed to the Cross-Florida Barge Canal, which was so strongly supported by your governor and by me, or the space effort at Cape Canaveral, or the Tampa Air Force Fuel Annex. They talk instead about Midwestern feed grain programs and Far Western reclamation projects. But out west, the economizers talk about the Tampa Air Force Fuel Annex. And so the argument goes on across the country. And fourth and finally, the question arises, will the fiscal policies of the government lead to inflation? And my answer to that is no. The danger of inflation arises when the level of total and private demand presses against our productive capacity. We are far from that today. Total output in this country would have to increase by $30 billion to reduce unemployment to 4%. Our productive plant still, as all of you know, is still well below what you could produce operating at maximum capacity. Idle men and machines allow plenty of room for decreased taxes and increased demand without the risk of inflation. The tax cut, moreover, can be expected to stimulate productivity and growth and thus add to our productive potential, lessening the danger of inflation. It's long been believed that a budget deficit automatically means inflation. The facts indicate otherwise. The record peacetime deficit of 1959 produced no inflation then or subsequently, nor have the deficits of recent years. In fact, most of our post-war inflation occurred in the year of budget surpluses, 47, 48, 51, 56, and 57. Recent scattered price increases have caused concern and stimulated fear that expanded demand would lead to inflation. But the wholesale price index so far shows little or no reflection of these increases. Some prices have been reduced, and most prices have not moved. Many of the increases have been in the price of raw materials, which have declined. And inasmuch as the trend of such prices have been stable or downward for a number of years, some recovery is not unexpected. But the abundance of the world's raw materials would indicate that even here, we do not have to fear serious inflationary pressures. Moreover, the current remarkable stability of labor costs per unit of output clearly indicates that such price increases as have occurred do not reflect a general upward surge of costs. I realize that there are some businessmen who feel only they want to be left alone, that government and politics are none of their affairs, that the balance sheet and profit rate of their own corporation are of more importance than the worldwide balance of power or the nationwide rate of unemployment. But I hope it's not rushing the season to recall to you the passage from Dickens' Christmas Carol, in which Ebenezer Scrooge is terrified by the ghost of his former partner, Jacob Marley. And Scrooge, appalled by Marley's story of ceaseless wandering, cries out, "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob." And the ghost of Marley, his legs bound by a chain of ledger books and cash boxes, replied, "Business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." Members and guests of the Florida State Chamber of Commerce, whether we work in the White House or the State House or in a house of industry or commerce, mankind is our business. And if we work in harmony, if we understand the problems of each other and the responsibilities that each of us bears, then surely the business of mankind will prosper. And your children and mine will move ahead in a secure world, and one in which there's opportunity for them all. Thank you.